we've missed covering the biggest story of how Apple makes its products over the last 20 years. If you're looking at all the manufacturing taking place for Apple in like year 2000, it's like 9 countries. By the end of the decade, it's basically just in China.
Which is basically still true today.
Oh, it's more true.
It was sort of an evolution that, one thing led to another, led to another, led to another, and oh my God, we're in China. The story you tell is that Apple basically exported its intellectual property to China. They didn't sell it to them. They trained them.
The Chinese are the biggest U.S. adversary in the world, and we're just gifting that, playing the role of Prometheus to the Chinese. So business ties unbreakable, political ties totally untenable. Wow, this should not be going on. But what China is getting out of it is essentially a national security risk.
Do you think anybody in the U.S. government really understands this?
I think Apple is really in a position where there's no winning formula. There's no obvious move to get out. You encircle your opponent so that they can no longer make any strategic moves. I think that is where Apple is right now. They cannot do anything to move to the US. They cannot make major moves to India. China has them captured.
Wow. Hi, Steve Eisman. Welcome to another edition of my podcast. So I have a very interesting guest today. Let me tell you the origin of it. A few weeks ago, I interviewed Wolfgang Munchau, who wrote a book called Kaput, The End of the German Economic Miracle. And I learned a lot from reading the book, but I also learned a lot from interviewing him. And I realized that in this time where trade is such a central topic, the details really matter. And we're going to talk about Apple today. We're having Patrick McGee, who is the author of a new book, Apple in China, which I spent the entire weekend reading.
Amazing.
I basically didn't leave my home. It was that good. Not a spy thriller, but still really good. And we're going to talk about how Apple got into China and what the implications of it are today. So why don't we go back to 1997. Steve Jobs has just come back. And I'm not interested in all the innovation that took place. I'm interested in something much more mundane, which is tell us, how did Apple make stuff back then? Actually manufacture it? How was it done?
Is it fine if I go back to 1996? The reason why is I think if we're doing 97, we're already falling into sort of the Apple trap.
Go where you want to go.
Steve Jobs is the person who says that 1997 is the nadir of Apple.
Right.
And that's because he's there. So he's the guy who pulls it out of the brink, right? I give him credit for that. But the worst time is the year before, spring of 1996. This is when they're days away from meeting payroll and when they've hired a Chapter 11 lawyer, which I think was revealed for the first time in the opening chapter of the book.
Yeah, I never heard of that before. I didn't know it was that. No, I don't think anybody knew it was quite that bad.
Yeah, and I named the law firm, just to give it some.
It's Harvey Miller, the famous bankruptcy lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, I say that in a footnote that I think I'm revealing that. It's not totally clear to me, but I've never seen it anywhere else, and it was news to me when I received it. So let's see. They have this like triple continent strategy, right? So Apple's founded in 1976, and the ethos back then really is that you build your own computers. I mean, just out of the necessity to some degree. I mean, there isn't globalization of electronics at that time. And if you remember like how Steve Jobs and Wozniak really become friends, it's that they're going to these like, what are they called? Like these like homestead brew meetings or what have you, where they're tinkering with computers and sort of imagining what the future might be and stuff. So once Apple develops, after a few years, they've got factories in California, in Ireland, and in Singapore. So they're sort of having like at the continental level, localized production and distribution. And they are really doing what you would now associate with someone like Foxconn. But that idea was just beginning to sort of come into existence for electronics. Certainly didn't.
Just tell everybody who Foxconn is. Everybody knows who that is.
Well, let's come back to that later.
We'll come back to Foxconn. Foxconn's not in the story yet.
I'm overcomplicating things just to say that Apple built their own computers.
They made them themselves in their own factory.
Their own circuit boards.
They designed it, they made it, they manufactured it.
Yeah, I mean, the first person making their circuit boards is literally Steve Jobs' pregnant sister. She's employee number 1 or number 2.
I love that part of the story.
Yeah,
she's doing it in her living room.
While she's on the phone, sort of like you can picture like a 1980s phone like on your shoulder while she's jamming these things together. Like not well at all, but like well enough.
Okay, so Jobs comes in and Tell us how it starts to evolve.
Well, so basically, when they're days away from bankruptcy, they sell this factory that they have in Colorado, Fountain, Colorado, and it nets them around $200 million, and it basically buys them some time. So while they're buying time, they're also doing an oversubscribed bond sale, and that's the origin story, really, of them heavily investing in outsourcing. So they're basically taking it off the balance sheet, their own manufacturing facilities, right? Their own workers that are dealing with manufacturing. And they're beginning to work with these companies that offer manufacturing as a service, right? So you're only paying for the manufacturing when you need it. So it's no longer a fixed cost, it's a variable cost. And that's like substantial savings. And the sort of quip that I use is that, Apple is late to building MP3 players. Apple is late to building phones. But when they do so better than everybody else. The supply chain story is essentially the same thing. They're not early in going to Asia, they're not early in going to China, but what they do when they make those moves is just better than anybody else.
Okay, so Jobs dies, Tim Cook takes over, and Tim Cook is not an innovator, but that's not important because from the book you're basically telling us is that Tim Cook took Apple to a whole other level of manufacturing and mass production that probably was unimaginable when Jobs came back in 1997.
Yeah. So we're skipping ahead quite a bit here,
yes.
right? So this is 1997. So Steve Jobs hires Tim Cook, who's a veteran of IBM.
Of IBM.
He's coming from Compaq. He's only been at Compaq a matter of 6 months before he moves to Apple.
Right.
And that's fascinating. Compaq is the largest PC maker at the time, and Tim Cook's in a really cushy role.
I remember I had one in law school.
Yeah, but there's something appealing about going to a company that's a total mess, right? Because if it's a logistical nightmare, then think of the influence Tim Cook can have, right? And he comes in as a senior vice president. So it's sort of a dream if you're like, he was known as the Attila the Hun of inventories. And so, in a sense, you would rather be at war if that's your sort of persona than be at a complacent company where maybe Compaq is already doing it. They maybe don't need Tim Cook's expertise to some degree, whereas Apple really needs it desperately. I mean, they really are close to bankruptcy. And even when they come out of it in the late 90s, they're once again close to bankruptcy in the dot-com crash. So, yes, so Tim Cook, I mean, in a sense, there's this narrative of mine that's like 4 or 5 chapters. I call it The Long March to China. And it's telling in just like intimate detail that's just we've never bothered to really think about before, which is that there's this long experimentation stage where Apple is getting to know how to work with outsourcers. And China's not really in the picture right away.
No, they're in Japan, they're in Taiwan. Where else were they?
South Korea is basically the home of the translucent iMac.
Right.
And LG, who's the builder of it, they expand. So they replicate this Apple tri-continent strategy. And so LG expands to Wales and to Mexico. And then Foxconn does come on board, but China is only one of the 3 areas. They're also doing Fullerton, California, and Czech Republic. And, this is just one product. Then you've got iPods and other products being made out of Taiwan, and they're relying on...
So they're all over the place.
They're really, it's like 9 countries. If you're looking at all the manufacturing taking place for Apple in like year 2000, it's like 9 countries. By the end of the decade, it's basically just in China.
So let's talk about that migration.
Yeah.
Because one thing I found fascinating in the book was that what did not happen was there was no meeting where the senior people at Apple got together in a room and somebody had a deck and made a presentation and argued that we should move our production to China.
Correct.
That decision was never made like that. It was sort of an evolution that one thing led to another, and oh my God, we're in China. And that's kind of what it felt like.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you picked up on that point because Tim Cook is always called the architect of the China strategy. And I'm not trying to discredit that idea. Like you could call him an admiral, like he navigated like something that was already happening.
He didn't make a decision.
He was not the decision maker.
Right.
If anyone was the decision maker,
who was the decision maker?
The suppliers were the decision makers.
Right. So explain that.
Yeah. So you've got to understand.
How did the suppliers? You describe in the book an evolution of companies that originated mostly in Taiwan, basically gradually migrated their entire manufacturing to China, and it felt like, tell me if you agree with this, that Apple followed them.
Yes, totally. Yeah, I mean, so for the iPod narrative, for instance, the first 3 generations of the iPod are made by a company called Inventec in Taiwan. Interestingly, the reason Inventec's so good at doing miniatures and why they're chosen in 2001 is that Apple had trained them in the 90s to build the Newton. So there is a sort of full circle moment there where when they need the iPod to be built 6 years later, they go back to the very company that's good at what they're doing because Apple trained them.
Okay.
So that's kind of a funny irony. But yeah, no, the Taiwanese become just really proficient in electronics. They begin with parts, they begin with motherboards, and then once you sort of begin to put those together, you're really doing final assembly, test, and pack, which is like the whole shebang. And they get to the point where they're literally competing with their clients, and often their clients don't like this very much, right? So you have someone like ASUS assembling a computer for you, but then ASUS begins marketing their own computers, right? So they're stamping some boxes, IBM, and they're stamping their other boxes, ASUS, and they're basically the same products.
Thing.
Yeah, and they're going maybe to different countries or what have you, but like it's a precarious position. Apple is never like that, right? So they choose someone like Foxconn who would never do that. Foxconn is never going to have a phone that rivals the iPhone.
They're a pure contract manufacturer.
Yeah. And it's a really unsexy thing to do. So this is the difference between an OEM, which is what Foxconn was doing, and an ODM. An ODM, D for design, means that the companies were trying to offload from the brands like IBM or Gateway more of the fixed costs, right? So in other words, if I could give you my research and development budget, if I could give you my design budget and just pick things out of a catalog created by the Taiwanese, then it was even easier for me as a Western company. But of course, Apple is this really innovative company who's more controlling. They would never stand for that. So I guess to sort of answer the question of the 2000s, the simplest thing to do is to point out that in the 80s and 90s, like the reason why computers go from thousands of dollars to just like, $800 in the course of 15 or 20 years is not really the likes of IBM and Gateway. It's that they're all relying on contract manufacturers, and those companies are in absolutely fierce battle to win these orders. And in order to do that, they're getting all sorts of M&A financing. So they become like a dream of the M&A bankers in the 90s, because like Selectron alone acquires 20 companies in that decade.
To become more efficient.
Yeah, well, to become more efficient, because it's so low margin. So the only way you can have like a big staff and then make sure they're always doing something is by having more and more clients. So it's cutthroat efficiency, and it means that you need to sort of be ultra agile with making sure that your teams are doing this product and that product. And especially if you're doing that against someone who's trying to do their own products themselves, I mean, you're just way, way better at where to allocate the resources. So because they're competing with them with each other in their own industry, this just causes the prices to fall and so forth. But what they do is they're the ones who go to Asia. And so that's
when you say they, who goes to Asia?
So Selectron, Celestica, Jabil, SEI, these are sort of the early companies that pioneer electronics manufacturing in the United States.
Okay.
And then there's like the compact shock. I think this is in 1992 or so. It's actually not in the book. But this is when compact shocks the industry by having prices that are all of a sudden something like 20 to 30% lower than everybody else. And how did they do it? They did it because they were the first to make this big, big push into Asia. So the contract manufacturers are the one that sort of outsource the jobs to Asia. And I guess what that means for the 2000s is that when Apple's nearly bankrupt in 1996, it's because Windows has caught up with them. And so there's nothing you can't do on a Windows machine once Windows 95 comes out that you can't, there's nothing you could do. What am I trying to say? There's nothing that you can't do on a Windows machine that you can do on a Mac, which is sort of true for multiple years until Windows 95 comes out. So the extra premium that you're paying for a Mac no longer makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. And so when Apple is then moving things to Asia, they're really just following everybody else. Taiwan is the place to be. But as Taiwan experiences labor constraints, rising value of the currency and so forth, they speak the same language as the mother of all developing
So they
countries.
basically move to China.
Yes. So I think I've got this great quote. It's on the record from John Rubinstein saying basically what happened is when you had extra capacity.
Who was John Rubinstein?
John Rubinstein, I'm sorry. He was the senior vice president of hardware.
Okay.
I mean, even Johnny Ive reported to him, very senior, worked with Steve Jobs for 16 years at, several companies. So the suppliers in Taiwan, when they needed more factory lines, they would say, we're going to open a factory in China and be doing it together, right? So they sort of tiptoe to China is what his quote is in the book. And then as things go better, as volumes grow, you're no longer just tiptoeing, you're just building first in China, and you're sort of leaving Taiwan behind. So there's this sort of natural consolidation. So as things go to China, other things go to China because you've got next door manufacturing, and the idea that, if you've got assembly in one plant, it really makes sense to sort of, pepper and salt, sorry, that's the wrong metaphor, dot around.
No, I understand. But what you're describing is that over something like a 10-year period, an entire electronic manufacturing ecosystem was created in China.
Yes.
Where there was just empty fields.
Yes. And nobody's really calling the shots. It's just, it makes sense for everybody on their own, narrow purposes that we're going to do this in China. Because if you have a factory in China, one in Europe, and one in the US, and you're just sort of sitting back somewhere in the US and comparing your costs, China's winning every time.
Right.
So nobody at Apple makes the decision. It just sort of accretes over time and consolidates.
And why do you think China, not India, or some other country with a large population?
I mean, the opening epigraph in my book is from Made in China 2015, and it's, without manufacturing, there is no country, there is no nation. I point that out because, or the reason it's the epigraph, is because China just really prioritizes manufacturing more than anybody else. That's just not what Narendra Modi or any of the previous prime ministers of India are really focused on. I'm not saying they don't accept the orders or whatever. Obviously, there's a manufacturing sector there. But for China, they really see it as the way out of the poverty trap, and they really see it today as the way to get out of the middle income trap and to be dominant in the world.
But, you know, some of the things that you describe in the book that you get in China, there are things in China you get that you don't get anywhere else, even without that push. So, example, there are no labor problems in China, because if there are labor problems in China, the Chinese government suppresses it. That doesn't happen that so easily in other countries.
I'm struggling to think of what you mean by there's no labor problems, because first of all, there are riots, right? And they do get suppressed, but that's different from saying there's no problem. They can deal with it in a way.
Yes, they deal with it in a way that a democratic country cannot deal with.
And if inflation of wages is problem, that also happens in China. So it's too simplistic to say there's no wages or there's no labor problems, but they can deal with them because they're an authoritarian government without a free media that you cannot do in South Korea where Samsung is made. You cannot do it in India where other products are made.
So I think you said by 2009, basically, Apple's making everything in China.
Yeah.
Which is basically still true today.
Oh, it's more true. I mean, so actually the big distinction between, let's say, 2009 and today, and this is so contrary to the general thing you believe about Apple, like Apple's line is no longer that their products are made in China. Like their marketing spiel is they're made everywhere. And what they try to focus on is that there are components and parts coming from all sorts of different countries. There's a real sleight of hand here. They're not really coming from all these different countries. There are a whole bunch of multinationals, but over time, they have all set up shop in China. And like, you can take my word for it, and I can cite documents if I need to, but I would just say run a common sense experiment here. You're doing almost 250 million iPhones a year. So at some times, peak season, an iPhone has 1,000 components and you're building 1 million a day. It would be ridiculous if you were waiting for components coming from 50 countries on a daily basis, hoping that they get through customs, hoping that the ships make it on time, etc. Clearly, they have been making them more and more in China year in, year out. So the location, the geography has definitely shifted to China over time. And then within China, it's become more and more local homegrown competitors that they're using. So everybody knows Foxconn, but you probably don't know so much about Pegatron, Wistron, and Quanta.
Those are Chinese companies.
These are Taiwanese companies.
Taiwanese companies.
Who have all been squeezed out. So Foxconn is also being squeezed, but the other three have really been sort of taken out of the Apple supply chain in favor of Luxshare, Goretech, Wingtech, and BYD.
Chinese companies.
These are the red supply chain, homegrown Chinese companies who have better local connections, who are able to get the lands, the tooling, the machinery from the government, and crucially things like labor. Right? I mean, if you want pools and pools of labor to fill in your factories, that is part of the state-sponsored repertoire of what China can give you.
So I wanted to. There's a line in your book that I want to explore a little bit more, because you're hinting at it right now, where you say that China made Apple into what it is, but it's also true that Apple made China into what it is.
Yeah. I think it's like, I was worried about mispronouncing this word. It's banal or banal or banal? How do you say it?
Banal.
Banal. Banal. I feel like it might
if you go to good schools, it's banal.
I feel like it's like one of the words where we think it's banal, and that's how I say it, but I think actually it might be banal. Anyway, the point is, it's totally banal to say that Apple wouldn't be Apple without China. I mean, I don't think there's any counter argument at all. The novelty of my book is I say that China really wouldn't be China without Apple.
So let's explore that.
That can sound absolutely ludicrous, and I'm aware of that, but it's like it's funny. I keep having to say, because in conversation, I'm obviously argumentative because I'm trying to consolidate, loads of research into just a few points.
Right.
But you'll know because you've read the book. The book is not like that. The book isn't an argument. The book is just a story demonstration.
This book is an evolution.
Yeah, but you'll notice I'm never batting you over the head with anything.
No, that's
think
true.
They're just slowly being convinced.
But that is one of the
they
points.
sleepwalk into
So
this.
I want, for my listeners, I want you to elaborate on that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious that without China, there's no way that Apple could have mass produced all its products to the degree that it has. And one thing that is great that you describe in the book, it's not just mass production. It's almost custom mass production.
Yeah,
because the intricacies of what is being made is so complicated that there's a line in your book where you say it's not that Apple was making 10 million Volkswagens, it was making 10 million Ferraris.
Right.
So that could not have happened except in China. That I think everybody accepts. But I want you to explore the opposite, is that because of Apple's influence and impact on China,
Yes.
China is what it is today.
So let me allude to what we do know about Apple and then what I sort of bring. It's sort of, someone called it like the missing anthropological element to the Apple story that I think the book elucidates. So what we do know about Apple is that Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive were maniacal and obsessive and detail-oriented about how their products would look and feel, right? So we know that. That's accepted.
That everybody knows.
What we don't know is that that's the top of the pyramid called industrial design. The next part of the pyramid is called product design, or PD. That's another team of brilliant people, but their job is not to question anything Johnny Ive's done. It's to sort of fulfill his wishes. And so if an iPod
No matter how difficult.
Correct. If Johnny Ive's design is going to be, this many centimeters across and this many centimeters wide or whatever, you have to fit all the components in there, in a beautiful fashion and have to do all sorts of things. It takes a different level of genius. And then what we've ignored and what I sort of go into great detail, and to some extent, this is the origin story of the book when I figured this out and that it hadn't been written about. The next stage is manufacturing design, or MD. And these are the guys who go to Asia.
With the prototype, sort of.
I suppose.
Well, the guys who were the level above, they made the prototype to show that now you got to mass produce it. Or am I missing something?
I guess I'm sure there's some cases where that's possible. In some cases, it would just be a blueprint. I actually have some drawings and stuff that I was given, so it wasn't a prototype that I'm thinking of. It was actually some etches. But nevertheless, they're the ones who go and build the parts that are needed. So in other words, the thing that makes Apple really different is they are not relying on component makers to come up with the next innovations. And they say, oh, that's great. We could probably use that in our next product. No, they are going to the suppliers and inventing those parts. So many things in the Apple products are custom and proprietary. And then it's not just the parts that they're being built. They're designing the machines that produce those parts.
And there's a part in the book where you describe how, I never heard of this before, that Apple would, at least in the beginning 10 years with China, they actually bought all the equipment for the contract manufacturers in China, the special equipment, and they would put it in the factory.
Yes.
And then they would let these contract manufacturers operate it. But the actual equipment they bought for them.
Yes, and they would tag it for Apple use only. And even the software that is running on those machines is Apple's, right? So we think of them as doing software for the devices that we have. They do the software for these machines as well. I mean, that this hasn't been written about is a little bit crazy because, my analogy is that, like, in the same way that Uber runs the largest taxi network in the world without owning any cars, Apple had really cracked the code on how to manufacture everything to the precision and quality and maniacal obsessive detailness as if you owned the factory
without owning the factory.
And so they're really orchestrating things from afar. And then just to skip ahead in the narrative a little bit here, Beijing doesn't know this, right? Like, nobody knows this. Apple's not issuing press releases about this. Other companies don't know this. So in 2007, like, Apple is basically like winning this award for supply chain efficiency, and the very researchers basically giving them this award. It's like, how did Apple even do this? Like, on like the peer ranking score of other companies rating each other, like, nobody was rating Apple well because nobody knew that they were doing anything. It was all secretive. And so you get into this really interesting part of the story, and this is to some extent how the book opens, that Xi Jinping comes into office.
Let's hold up on that for a second. There was something I wanted to emphasize. There's a quote in the book, I forget what year it was, but you say that iPhones represented 20% of the volume, but 80% of the profits.
Yes.
And correct, and I want to make sure I get this right and add anything you like. Basically, what you say is Apple is just so much better at manufacturing because of other things that you just said. And therefore, their profit margins are so much bigger that they make 80% of the profits, but they only sell 20% of the phones.
Yeah. I mean, so what I say, maybe I don't say this in the book, but I allude to it at least, like find me another industry where that's remotely true.
Oh, I never heard of anything like that before.
I mean, it's absolutely exceptional.
Right.
And the crazy thing is just that we sort of accept like, well, yeah, I guess they're expensive. That makes sense. Like,
it's
no,
not the expense.
Like, we need to think about how insane this statistic is.
Right.
I mean, because
it's not that they're charging an extra $100.
Right. All the other phone makers have expensive phones.
Right.
It's not just that they're selling them at an expensive level. I mean, you know, the statistics today are basically that like the average Android costs $300. The average iPhone costs about $1,000. I might be off by $50 here or there, but that's basically the gist, right? They do charge about triple the average cost. That wouldn't be the case, by the way, if you went down to the local store. But globally, a lot of phones in India, a lot of phones in China are costing, you know, $150 or $200. And so that's how you get to those levels. Yeah, the reason here, and I'm trying to coin a term, we'll see if anyone picks up on it. This is not the term used within Apple, is called the Apple squeeze.
I was about to bring that up, the Apple squeeze.
Yeah. So the understanding is basically that when they go to their supplier, right, Apple has all sorts of, you know, brands behind it. But the main thing is they have is crazy orders, right? And so they're in a real position of leverage to say, if you want to work with us, we're going to need you to build 230 million of whatever component it is you make, because that's how many iPhones we have, right?
Right.
So the order volume is enormous. And so they're able to say, like, we're basically going to give you almost zero margin, and you might get rich just based off the volumes. But the other thing is that we are going to train the hell out of your entire workforce. And so instead of thinking of it as you're getting low margin and this isn't a good business, you should be thinking of it, we're giving you free tuition for brilliant training.
And that's the part of the book where you're saying this is how Apple made China.
Yeah, so that's what Terry Guo, the founder of Foxconn, a Taiwanese contract manufacturer that becomes like really the big partner of Apple to build all the products that you've basically been buying the last 20 years. That's what he understands from the get-go. I mean, he does it to such an extent that he's almost like playing Apple a little bit, right? So like Tony Fadell told me, Tony Fadell being like the pod father, right? Senior vice president of iPod in the mid 2000s. I mean, he said like Apple engineers would come in one day to like, work with the manufacturing force that they've been training for the last few months. And lo and behold, it's a whole new cohort of people, because Terry Guo basically like took those people who now have all these Apple skills and he wants them to go do what they can do for Dell, for Compaq, for all the companies where they can actually make money.
Right.
And so it's like a new semester had started and people like Fidel would be like, oh God, we have to train these
all
these
over again.
Yeah. So there's something fascinating about that. And then again, I'm skipping ahead of the narrative a little bit. A lot of the Chinese suppliers don't get that point until 2015, 2016, when I'm skipping ahead, but like Tim Cook makes it explicit to Chinese officials.
So let's come to that. So
Yeah,
in 2013, there's a new pres,
Xi Jinping.
Xi
Yeah.
Jinping, and all of a sudden the tone changes in China.
Like so abruptly.
Like we're here, and then what happened?
Yes.
So tell us what happened with Xi Jinping, and how did Apple react?
So, gosh, it's such a complicated narrative, and I don't know how much I need to emphasize like the retail story, but like basically this story only makes sense if you have the most basic understanding that in 2010, the iPhone becomes the conspicuous must-have product all across China.
Right.
So I think it's from 2009 to 2012, Apple revenue in the country goes from about 1 billion to like 22 billion. And so China very much sees like, we are the reason Apple is growing so fast, because not only are we providing a base for their worldwide
So the
production,
way they see it is, we gave all this to you. What do you give us?
Yes.
And that's kind of their attitude.
And the hardliners in Beijing don't really like that the next generation loves this Western company.
Right.
Right? Because the iPhone, I mean, it's the most capitalist thing in the world.
Right.
Right? It's a little emblem of capitalism. And people love it so much that there's literally like a black market across the country to buy iPhones at inflated prices. And, there's editorials in the Beijing papers like against this kind of thing. And they can't stop their own people from buying these devices. So they sort of have a bone to pick with Apple over that. But again, they don't understand the way Apple's contributing. And so what happens is, every March in China is something called Consumer Day, which is when companies get scolded for not living up to like the socialist values of the country.
And Apple gets scolded.
And Apple gets scolded March 2013. This is literally within 36 hours of Xi Jinping ascending to the presidency. And the idea that Apple like the biggest, manufacturer in the country, like through its indirect ways, of course, and the biggest Western company operating as a retail presence. The idea that they would be attacked without Xi Jinping giving the clearance, I think
Impossible.
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 To know anything about China is to know that he's
I don't know about China.
absolutely...
It's impossible.
So I don't think it's unfair at all to say Xi Jinping directly attacks Apple.
Yes.
And so Apple is put into this position of thinking, oh my, are we going to be blacklisted? And
China.
That's not an idle threat. Facebook is blacklisted. Google is blacklisted. That is a real threat. And so it takes them a few years to basically come up with a counter narrative, if you will. But it's like how do we convince Beijing and provincial policymakers that we are a mass contributor of what China calls indigenous innovation?
And how do they do that?
Well, so they believe at first, the team tasked with doing this, that we're going to have to bring joint ventures to the country. And a joint venture is what the Chinese have been wanting for decades, which is that, Steve, you want to bring your business over to China? Great.
You got a partner.
Half of the business is going to be Chinese. They're going to learn everything you know.
Right.
So they can learn, mimic.
But Apple didn't have to do that.
And they basically oust you. Well, the reasons they didn't have to was sort of, again, because they were doing stuff under the radar for a long time.
That was like a joint venture.
No, not like a joint venture at all. Apple had enormous control, but they were orchestrating things from afar. They just had people coming in on flights and then going to various factories and sort of taking indirect control of these factories and training people. But everything was sort of happening at a distance, right? They weren't setting up facilities. Mm-hmm. So they had a business license to do this kind of thing, but nobody knew what they were doing. I mean, until 2012, that's the first year that Apple actually puts out a document saying, here are our main suppliers. You didn't know which suppliers were working for Apple. And it's not it's not easy to tell. We're talking about a country where there are just factories producing electronics all over the damn place.
So how did Apple convince China that they were good corporate citizens?
So you have this team of people known internally as the Gang of Eight. And this is the first time Apple has senior people living in the country. Before 2013,
they're just schlepping back and forth.
They're going back and forth. There are about 1,000 local engineers, but they're not vice presidents or anything.
Okay.
This is a team that has 2 vice presidents, that has a head of local Apple University, people running procurement, people running retail sales, people running channels. You got the first person really running government affairs. And so it's this team that comes up with the idea of, if Beijing understands how intimately we are working hand in glove with all of these suppliers, and then sort of saying, go forth and multiply, so that they bring their skill sets to a next generation of Huawei, Oppo, Vivo, et cetera, then they will understand that the Apple model is actually better for China than the joint venture model they want us to do. And this really culminates with Tim Cook going to Zhongnanhai, the citadel of communist power, you could call it the White House of Beijing, in May 2016 with 2 other top Apple executives. And they submit this memorandum of understanding that basically commits to investing, crucial distinction, investing $275 billion over the next 5 years, basically telling them all the ways in which we are contributors to massive innovation in China. So in a sense, get off our back. Don't put up obstacles in what we're trying to do, because
we're so helpful to you.
We're so helpful to you.
Right. And China accepted it, sounds like.
I mean, Apple hasn't really had any major problems in China since then, for the exception that the more Apple tries to sort of take control of content on the iPhone, iTunes Store and, Music Plus and all these kind of things that they like to do that have to do with content, like China's not game with that sort of stuff. So, fast forwarding to their predicament now with AI, like they need a local partner, and that's going to cause them all sorts of problems. But in terms of manufacturing and like fines for doing things, like
they've been fine.
They haven't had to do that, but they have had to accede to requests to ban the New York Times, ban WhatsApp, ban VPNs. Apple doesn't really have any political capital to expend there.
So let's fast forward to now. Apple was so successful in teaching China its skills that China makes phones now as good as Apple's.
I think they're better.
You think they're better?
I think they're demonstrably better.
Well, tell me how they're better.
Well, because Apple doesn't even have a foldable iPhone yet.
That's true.
Huawei has one that unfolds twice. So it's a little bit thicker than an iPhone. And once it unfolds twice, it's the size of a standard iPad.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's called the Mate XD. It's a trifold phone.
Okay.
I've played with it.
Yeah.
It's a marvel of industrial engineering. and it's a $2,800 phone. Now, critics in the West have basically said like, oh, it's a $2,800 phone. You're not going to sell it in big volumes. They're missing the bigger picture. It was only 2014 that Johnny Ive was complaining about Chinese mimicry, right? And these cheap phones. Just think of the whole idea of like when we were growing up, made in China inherently meant it was cheap quality. Now you're telling me Huawei is selling a more expensive phone with features and technology that Apple can't perform? I mean, the first foldable phone from Apple is hopefully next year. The trifold iPhone? I mean, it's not even on the product roadmap.
So why do you think that Apple hasn't innovated as much as the Chinese phone companies seem to have?
I don't know that I have a really sophisticated answer other than one thing is that if you're making as many iPhones as they are, it is difficult to make big design changes because of just the titanic effort of what that entails. If you're making 5 million iPhones a year, it's easier to experiment a little bit.
Okay.
It's harder when you're doing
Huawei can do it because they were smaller.
Except that Huawei is big too.
They're big.
I'm actually thinking more of companies like OnePlus or nothing.
But I'm thinking of Huawei. Huawei makes phones better than Apple, and they're able to seem to innovate better.
If you say necessity is the mother of invention, Huawei was really put under a gun by Donald Trump, who deprived Huawei in 2019 of basically American-made technology. So Huawei was no longer able to use 5G chips made by Qualcomm and no longer able to use Google services, which didn't really matter necessarily for China because they already sort of don't use a lot of the Google services. But I mean, I owned a Huawei in 2018 living in Germany. It was a big phone there, right? And they partnered with Leica, local camera brand and everything. So that really mattered for their efforts abroad. And that mattered because Huawei outsold the iPhone globally in 2019. So when Donald Trump went after Huawei, that really mattered. And the Huawei phone business nearly collapsed. Now, Huawei itself does a lot more, right? They do infrastructure on the levels of like an Ericsson or a Siemens, in addition to just handset business. But that was really tough for them. But what it meant was that for 4 years, they were in like hyper work mode to innovate on everything and take greater control. So they're a much more vertically integrated company today, doing a lot more in chip design, a lot more in building their own OS. Well, they relied on Google for the Android OS before. Once you were no longer capable of that, it was supposed to sort of like, go after, it was like a, if you go after the king, you better kill him. Is that the line? Trump got like short-term progress by going after Huawei, and Apple was the great beneficiary.
But he didn't kill it.
And now they're back with a vengeance, and now they're building better phones than iPhone. Tim Cook and Apple haven't been under the same pressure to really innovate and respond. Huawei had to sort of come up with something to prove themselves. That's not the decisions Apple.
But Huawei now outsells Apple probably by a lot.
In China, they do, not globally.
In China. That's what I meant, in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Apple has fallen to like 4th in China. I mean, they really are struggling in China. And the more that AI is like the feature that you want on your phone, the more that they're going to struggle.
And why is that?
Because they're not allowed to use things like ChatGPT in China. So they have to find a local partner. And then their own homegrown efforts are terrible. I mean, just look at Siri. I mean, Siri,
it's awful.
Even Satya Nadella at Microsoft has said Siri is dumb as a rock. Yeah.
Which actually brings us to an interesting sort of thought. Has Apple stopped innovating? I mean, they spent it feels like, once the iPad was built.
Yeah.
Once the watch was built, your story is basically the tremendous innovation that happened in Apple was in the manufacturing of all these products.
Yes.
Not in the creation of new products.
Correct. I'm only sighing because it's not what I focus on in the book. I don't think it's the existential crisis for Apple. I think most people that own an iPhone today are going to buy an iPhone next year or the year after.
I'm one of those people.
Yeah. So it's not that it's having some tangible impact, but at the same time, I do think it's undeniable. On the other hand, it's sort of difficult to gauge because they are having innovations that are taking place within the iPhone, right? I mean, you could probably say like the way that the camera has developed over the last 10 years is in itself a great innovation, but it's just happening within the product rather than a whole new product. Because there's way too much discussion from 2015 to the present of like, what's the next big thing at Apple? And it's like the iPhone is such a big thing that it doesn't have some obvious successor.
Well, the next big thing of Apple was services. That was
Well,
that was the next big thing.
But that is Tim Cook.
Right.
And so you would give credit to Tim Cook
Yes,
for that.
no, I definitely
And it's
would.
probably been smart for them to get into, I wouldn't say banking. What I'm referring to is the Apple Wallet, the Apple credit card, that sort of thing. So services, yes. But yeah, look, it is undeniable that, you're not having the one more thing moments the way you used to under Steve Jobs.
Fair.
My criticism of Tim Cook, I think, is a little more biting, which is that he's the operations guy. And my point is that he's failed in operations.
And he's failed in operations because
They've absolutely tied their fate to China.
Correct.
They cannot leave.
So let's explore that for a second, because at the height of the tariff situation, which may come back, but in April, you read a lot of reports that Apple was moving as quickly as possible to move stuff out of China into India.
Mm-hmm.
And then I read your book and realized that's not happening.
No.
And why don't you elaborate on how difficult it is to get out of China and to diversify out of China?
One thing we've misunderstood is that people like to say, oh, China's actually not contributing very much to the iPhone, because if you break open an iPhone and you look at all the components, you'll see a lot of Japanese, Korean, American companies. And so it's like, oh, well,
But they're all in China.
Well, but that's one of the things people don't get. The other thing people don't get is Corning might make the glass for the iPhone, but Corning doesn't make it in that shape. Corning makes glass that comes,
in a
several
sheet.
meters by several meters,
Right.
And then a company called Lens Technology, cuts and tempers and shapes it. So that's a major contribution. And this is sort of down the line. There's lots of, metal stamping and etching and all kinds of processes that are taking place in China. And then in addition to that point, that a lot of those Korean and Japanese companies, et cetera, are doing this scale in China. So the contribution that China is making is not just last stop in one global production line, which is sort of what you get out of the Wall Street Journal. So the contributions that Apple's making are spectacular, and you can just see it in their own investment figures, some of which is public, by the way. I mean, they have something in their 10K called long-lived assets in China. And it's crazy in the mid-2000s that figure is hundreds of millions of dollars. This is when they're buying machinery for the first time. And it gets to, I think, $14 billion in 2015. I mean, these are insane numbers.
So do you think, look, it's a new world under President Trump. He's trying to remake the entire world trade system. Apple's 100% in China. He did eliminate the tariffs on Apple products coming into the United States from China, but that could change on a dime.
Yeah.
So, if you were sitting in the boardroom with Tim Cook, what do you think the discussion is like now? What are they saying? What do we do?
Yeah. So, okay. So I didn't quite.
They put all the eggs in one basket.
Yes. Well, and my line on that is and then the basket became a surveillance state.
Right. It was always a surveillance state.
I would disagree. I think Xi Jinping really took China in a different
I meant
direction.
Xi Jinping.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't fully answer the last question, which is that when Apple says they're moving to India, they're not correcting reporters when reporters say they're moving production. They're not really moving production. They're moving assembly. So the depth and breadth of manufacturing taking place in China is basically getting the iPhone to a sub-assembled state. Then it's shipped to India, where it goes through final assembly.
And why would you want to do that?
Okay, because tariff law only requires that there's one last substantive change to the product, and then you can say made in India.
Okay.
So if you go through that process, you avoid any tariff.
So if India has good trade relations with the United States, they're going to want to do as much of that through India as possible.
Yeah.
Of course, President Trump wants them to do it in the United States.
Yeah, and that's just
not going to happen.
We can talk about that, but it's one of these things that it's surprising that it keeps coming up because we're nowhere near that.
Just put it to bed. Why do you think that's impossible?
Let me give you sort of two answers. One is just the population. We just don't have that Nietzschean will to power we talked about for manufacturing is our thing. China, entire policies are tailor-made for manufacturing to be, to have capital lured into the country and to have these tax-exempt zones where everything's built and then shipped off. We just do not have that, and we're not going to have that. And we're not going to be competitive. We don't have the low wages. We don't have the dynamism of the population, the density of the population. We don't have the experiential know-how. There's probably 15 other things. So it really just is a fantasy.
By the way, even if we could, the story that you tell is a 10, 15-year story. From the time that China started to move into China until this entire ecosystem was created is a 15-year story.
I think it's probably a 40-year story. It really is 1980 to the present.
But let's assume it's 15.
Well, you're making it too easy.
It's long enough.
Yeah, exactly.
If to move stuff here would take, to build an entire ecosystem that could build iPhones would take a decade at
Now,
least.
One thing I would say, Apple's under such political pressure, not from Beijing, from Washington,
Yes.
that it would not be shocking to hear that there are going to be some iPhones made in the US, but it would just be the assembly. It would be a show and tell party. Exactly.
Okay.
But politically, they are being put in such a bind that might have to be the next press release. But I would call.
But you think,
Yeah.
regardless of the window dressing, Apple's going to stay in China.
I think they have to. The other answer I wanted to give is historical, which is that Apple wanted to make the Mac Pro in Texas, and it's such a fiasco that like two things happen. One, engineers from Foxconn, Chinese engineers, have to come into the Flex factory in Texas to actually make this happen.
Why? Why?
Because we don't have the skill set.
We don't have the skill set.
Yeah, we're in the heartland of Texas, and like we just don't have the experiential know-how to make it happen. And so, irony of ironies, we're bringing the very people that we've trained over the last 10 years to make it happen.
Okay.
So that's one thing that's crazy. The other thing is that's to make a product in volumes of 500 or 600 per day. The iPhone's 1 million per day. If you're not making Mac Pros in Texas, you're sure as hell not making iPhones anytime soon.
From where you sit, given the whole trade situation, what risks does Apple run right now, in your view?
Well, just any sort of blow up with China.
So if these trade negotiations go poorly, and who knows if they will or they won't, Apple's in deep doo-doo.
I think Apple is really in a position where there's no winning formula. There's no obvious move to get out, right? People keep asking me the policy question, which is like, what should Apple do? And it's like, A, above my pay grade.
And I think what you're saying is they're stuck.
They're stuck. That is the whole thesis. If there was some easy move, then it would frankly be easier for Apple to put out a press release that says, well, the book is wrong because we're doing this in India. But good luck really accelerating in India when China has you so surrounded, let's say. If you think of like the game of Go, sort of the Chinese version of chess, your goal in that is not to cause checkmate, right? You're never going after the king and then knocking that king over. There's no declarative move that ends that game. Instead, you encircle your opponent so that they can no longer make any strategic moves. I think that is where Apple is right now. They cannot do anything to move to the US. They cannot make major moves to India. China has them captured.
Wow. So I have since we're coming to the end, for the second edition of your book, so you mentioned that in the beginning of our conversation, the epigraph that you have at the book about how important manufacturing is in China. So as I was reading the book, I came up with 2 additional epigraphs for you.
Okay.
In the second edition, think about it. You could add told to me by Steve Eisman.
I was going to say, do I get to pretend that I came up with these? No,
you can pretend. It's okay. I give it to you free of charge.
I'm excited.
Okay.
Give it to me.
So the first one is, I got 2. Okay. The first one is Mark chapter 8, verse 36. What doth it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul?
I think about that one all the time. I'm a religion major, so yeah, that speaks to me.
Okay. And the second one, which is attributed to Lenin, not John Lennon,
no, I already
but attributed to, you know where I'm going, which is, we will hang the capitalists with the rope that they will sell us.
Yes, I've said that. There's basically my story is the
that's your story.
Digital equivalent.
This is the digital equivalent of the rope.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it's that not only did they elevate China, they created their own competition that's starting to outsell them.
Yeah, and the significance of the book is not just to say that they're stuck. I mean, that was probably how I pitched the book, right? But the business ties are unbreakable. And yet, if you understand what Apple is doing in China, politically, it's untenable. Because the Chinese are the biggest US adversary in the world. The idea that we should be allowing Apple to send America's best to be training an army of workers day in, day out, month in, month out,
and the best technology,
is nuts. So you might say, oh, well, it's not a big deal because after all, the smartphone world is saturated. Fine. The Vision Pro, which is stunningly good in terms of the actual technology, in terms of content, it's terrible. I mean, Apple has really screwed this up. But in terms of if you put that thing on, have you ever tried it?
I've never tried it.
It is amazing what it is capable of. Again, it's not really doing much, but in terms of what it is capable of, it's amazing. Well, it's all assembled by Luxshare. Luxshare is the biggest Chinese competitor to Foxconn. Its founder is, affiliated with the party.
Right.
And it takes all kinds of automation to build that thing. And so how do they build it? Well, Apple's training them how to build it. What are they going to do with those skills?
Do you think anybody in the U.S. government really understands this?
Well, no is the simple answer. I guess I'm not wanting to give an answer that sounds arrogant. Who knows what sort of intelligence is that I'm unfamiliar with. But what I would say is we've missed covering the biggest story of how Apple makes its products over the last 20 years. And so if we in the media have sort of failed to do our job to focus on, I mean, it's a manufacturing company and we don't write anything about their manufacturing.
No, I think it's amazing that the story you tell is that Apple basically exported its intellectual property to China. They didn't sell it to them. They trained them.
So there's this 2013 hearing.
And this is our adversary.
Yes.
That's what's so crazy.
That's what's nuts. So Senator Levin attacks Apple in 2013 for treating Ireland like a tax haven. And so what he says is Apple basically like relies on, a stable government, an innovative country, great engineers coming out of MIT and Caltech, creates these great products, and then it shuffles as much product revenue to Ireland as possible, where it gets taxed at 2% or whatever, right?
Right.
And he says this is basically
This is terrible.
This is like a betrayal.
Right,
All this money should really be going to like building like American schools, supporting the American military, and so forth.
Right.
And I think in retrospect, Senator Levin doesn't know the half of it. We're not just exporting money. I mean, that's fungible.
Right.
We're exporting how to build stuff.
Right.
Experiential know-how. The other epigraph, which I'd have to read because it's a lengthy paragraph, is that like that was the basis for the British Revolution, Industrial Revolution, right? It was that tacit knowledge of how to do stuff, how to build, how to innovate that was so instrumental to Britain becoming an empire. And we're just gifting that, playing the role of Prometheus to the Chinese. So again, business ties unbreakable, political ties totally untenable. Wow, this should not be going on.
So it's I best we could conclude by saying this is not a situation in equilibrium, but how that non-equilibrium is going to break, we don't know.
I mean, Tim Cook's line is that it's a mutually symbiotic relationship between Apple and China. I would think of it as mutually exploitative. But what China is getting out of it is essentially a national security risk.
To us.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So not many corporate histories all go to the direction of having geopolitical implications. But if you understand how large this $3 trillion company is and how they get $100 billion in profits a year, and that everything is located in China, and you understand the sort of perfection obsessiveness of Apple.
So this is the rope multiplied to infinity.
I mean, yeah, this was just like in the pitch stage of the book or the early research. Once I was putting things together, it was just jaw on the floor. Oh my God, there's a massive narrative here.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That was great.
You.
That was wonderful.
Cheers.
A quick disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. The hosts and guests may hold positions in stocks discussed. Opinions expressed are their own and not recommendations. Please do your own due diligence and consult a licensed financial advisor before making any investment decisions.